So as we head into a holiday weekend, I thought it might be a good idea to take a look at where the industry of podcasting is in 2024. And coincidentally, Edison Research just came out with their Podcast Consumer 2024 report, which I want to take a walk through with you today.
And now, a look at what's trending in the podcast world and how it can help your show. It's the Jag Show Podcast.
Now, if you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, I'm going to give you a lot of numbers. I'll try to make it as straightforward as possible. But if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to put up the slides from Edison Research so you can follow along. Might be a little bit easier for you. Here's the title slide from their deck, 6 points. Podcasts have more listeners than ever. Listeners spend more time with podcasts than ever. Podcasts reach all generations. Podcast listeners are diverse. Podcast listeners are a highly coveted audience for advertisers, and podcasts reach receptive audiences. So let's break that down a little bit. 2/3 of the U.S. population, age 12 and up, have listened to a podcast. Half have listened in the last month, approximately, and just over a third have listened in the last week. All three of those numbers are record highs. Thought you might find this interesting. For Q1 of 2024, per Edison Research and their metrics, these are the top 50 podcasts in the U.S. We'll zoom in on the top of the list. Number 1, Joe Rogan Experience. Number 2, Crime Junkie. Number 3, The Daily from the New York Times. Number 4, New Heights with Jason and Travis Kelce. Thank you, Taylor Swift. Number 5, Dateline NBC. Rounding out the top 10, This American Life, Call Her Daddy, Smartless, Morbid, and Stuff You Should Know. Since this infinite dial study has been going since 2014, the average time spent listening to podcasts has grown 450%. And if you break that down, if you look at time spent listening to audio sources, in 2014, podcasts were just 2%. Now, podcasts 11%. That's all audio sources. If you zoom into ad-supported audio sources, podcasts make up 20% of all listening. It continues to grow. Podcast listening does span all demographics, including age. In the survey for age 12 to 34, 59% are monthly podcast listeners. 35 to 54, it's 55%. And you might be surprised to know that age 55 plus, that's 27%. So there's not an insignificant number of folks over 55 listening to podcasts. Now, of course, the younger demos are really the most loyal. Okay, what about Gen Z? For the purposes of this survey, they counted that as those born 2000 or later. For these folks who started listening as kids, because podcasts were out when they were kids, they spent an average of 3 hours more per week with podcasts than those who started listening later in life. And among those Gen Zers, which they're calling age 13 to 24, again, for the purposes of this survey, 84% listen to dig deeper into topics they're interested in, 74% listen to hear unique perspectives, 66% to stay up to date with latest topics, and 61% to stay up to date with social issues. Podcast listeners are diverse and increasingly female. Per the Infinite Dial 2024 study, 48% of Black Americans listen to podcasts every month, and 43% of Latinx Americans listen to podcasts every month. 10 years ago, 67% of podcast listeners were white. Now only 58% are white, with each demographic getting a slightly larger piece of the pie. And the gender gap is closing. 45% of those who identify as women in the U.S. are monthly podcast listeners. That number is closer to a 50-50 split between men and women than it was 10 years ago. And interestingly enough, female weekly podcast listeners listen to more episodes per week than male weekly podcast listeners. And this is a stat that's been true since I first got into podcasting. Compared to the U.S. population in general, podcast listeners are more employed, more educated, and more affluent. I'm going to link to all these slides in today's show notes if you want to look at them yourself. Podcast ads are effective. 46% of weekly podcast listeners have purchased a product or service as a result of hearing an ad on a podcast. 46%. Podcasts are still growing. They really took off in 2020 for obvious reasons, tailed off a bit in 2021, and then rebounded hard after that, and the growth is continuing exponentially. If your business does not have a podcast, whether it's internal for your employee information or external to tell the world about you or your service, you are missing the boat. If you have questions about podcasting or need some help starting or improving yours, you can find me at jagindetroit.com or on social at jagindetroit. Have a great holiday weekend, everyone. Later.
The most popular ways to grow a podcast are recommendations of friends and family. So share this episode with someone you know. And for any questions you have about podcasts, find Jag online at jagindetroit.com.